Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. You've reached the USAID Global Health Supply Chain Procurement Supply Management Human Resources webinar. How do we address high staff turnover rates? My name's Andrew Brown. I'm the Workforce Development Specialist for the project. And it's my pleasure to be leading this webinar for you today. This webinar is designed to do three things for you. One is to explain the main reasons why people leave an organisation. The second is to get you to consider local factors that contribute to staff retention, and also for you to consider steps that you could take to increase staff retention, particularly in resource-limited settings. One of the first things to think about is why did you leave your last job? Why are you staying in your current job? As you reflect on the answers that you're providing, you will appreciate that there is a great diversity in relation to why people move between organizations, but a lot of commonality, and it might not be what you think. Through this presentation, I want to do some industry comparison of staff turnover rates, talk about the cost of high staff turnover, some interesting thoughts from the supply chain sector, and then look at some research that's been conducted that really helps us to understand why staff leave organizations, help us to focus on staff motivation and engagement as a way of keeping staff. But then realizing that as we look at human resources and human resources sustainability, it's important that we have a systematic understanding of human resources. And we want to talk about the people that deliver theory of change and how that fits into this context. Then give you some practical approaches for staff retention and leave you with a range of tools that can measure potential impact and cost of different decisions as you seek to improve motivation and engagement. So let's move forward together. So two terms that I want to make sure that you're clear on. This is the maths associated with this particular webinar, if you like. So staff turnover rate, if you take 100 employees and 10 of those staff leave, then we say that there's a staff turnover rate of 10%. So it's a measure of staff leaving an organisation. Well, on the other hand, staff retention rate, if you've got 100 staff and 90 staff remain, you've got a staff retention rate of 90%. Relatively straightforward, but across the industry, that is the human resources industry, in many organisations, these are the terms that are applied. It's interesting to note, and this research is from the United States, is that there is this overall trend of employees remaining in their jobs less time than before. So for example, 2016, 4.2 years, but in 2014, it was 4.7 years. And again, slightly different for men and women for a variety of reasons. But the particular thing to note is that people are staying in their job less. For high-income countries like the UK and shortly USA, they actually publish staff turnover rates as a way of measuring what's happening in industries. And on the screen is a range of staff turnover rates by industry. It's interesting to note that distribution, which is a way of describing supply chain in the UK, have a staff turnover rate of 13.5%, general management and admin 3.1%, and publishing and events 17.7%. So different industries have quite a variety of staff turnover rates. And what you're particularly interested in is how your organisation goes to other organisations in the same environment. And particularly of interest would be across sector types, so government versus private sector and so on. Unfortunately, that level of detail doesn't really exist, but it's something that you could seek and see if it's available in your local environment. What's interesting is the US have quite different numbers. The staff turnover rate here from the Bureau of Labour Statistics, manufacturing only 2.4%, trade, transportation and utilities, supply chains in here, 3.7%, and a notice that in the government environment there is a staff turnover rate of about 1.5%. Again, people enjoying the security of government positions. Some separate research, which I haven't presented here, showed a staff turnover rate for some US industries up in the teens. So again, there's variety. And on average, human resource experts would say that if you've got a staff turnover rate under 10%, then that should be the range that you're looking for. So it'd be interesting for you to find out, particularly if you're a manager, what the staff turnover rate is in your organization, and to think about what that means in terms of people leaving the organization. The other interesting thing about staff turnover rates is who was it that left? And if it's more your particular high-end skilled people, then that's something that could be of concern to you. The cost of high staff turnover is quite significant, and often there are hidden costs. So we've got the financial costs of hiring and training, overall business performance, where we have reduced profits and customer satisfaction, daily task management, so the quality and quantity of work decreases. And what's interesting is you can have a situation where companies develop a negative reputation for future employees. If staff turnover rates are high, people talk, particularly in competitive industries, and some employers become preferred compared to others. One of the things that's often under considered when it comes to high staff turnover is team dynamics. So you can have reduced team rapport, changed workloads to meet the shortfall, and people feeling more pressured because of staff turnover, particularly when new staff take time to be employed and time to be onboarded for them to be productive. So particularly from this slide, I want you to be thinking about company image and also team dynamics as probably some of the under considered things in terms of the cost of staff turnover. As we move to consider the supply chain sector, there's a couple of publications that have come out over the last 6 months, which is interesting. This particular quote is taken from a infographic put out by Gartner. You can actually go to the website and see this in great detail. But I just wanted to point out that their quote from that here, which is nearly 1 in 5 executives from supply chain cites developing, training, retaining, and managing supply chain talent as the top 3 obstacles to achieving an organization's supply chain goals and objectives. In other words, people management as a main issue that needs to be addressed if an organization was going to actually meet what it wanted to achieve in terms of goal and objectives. So there's this great awareness that doing supply chain, involving yourself as an organization in talent and looking after people in your organization is important. But let's look at this next. This is quite a busy slide, and take the time to have a look. But this was done by Kronos and looked at sort of future workplace 2017 study. They looked at 614 organizations, and here are 4 key and concerning revelations. One is that organizations burn and churn talent, making it tough to build an engaged workforce. So 46% of HR leaders suggest that it was burnout responsible for up to half the staff turnover, so overworking staff. Too much work and too little pay are problematic, but many issues fueling burnout are in HR's control. So although unfair compensation or unfair pay is a component, unreasonable workload and too much overtime were the next 2 in this particular study. And as we'll see in a couple of slides, a number of other studies have shown that the main reason for people leaving is often far from being financial. There are lots of barriers preventing HR from improving retention. So 87% of leaders are calling for improved retention and making it a critical or high priority. But 20% said they've got too many other priorities to focus on fixing the issues. So it's almost like people feel it's too hard. And then in this final highlighted comment, There's well-documented costs of employee turnover. We discussed those previously, but organizations are more apt and interested in investing in recruitment rather than retaining existing talent. And in an environment where supply chain talent, particularly leadership and management talent, is rare, this is a very risky strategy. And so, and of concern. Often managers find dealing with people difficult, but it is important to deal with the human resources as an investment in a productivity and the life of a particular company, ensuring that your leaders and managers have the skills to be able to engage in improving this HR component. But I think you'll agree with me that there's sort of this concern here. On one hand, there's a realization of the problem of staff turnover, but then this sort of lack of prioritization to deal with it in many organizations. I note that a lot of these surveys are done in high-income countries, but in my experience and talking to a range of colleagues, a lot of these aspects are also relevant in low and middle income contexts. So why do staff leave? Think about the reason you gave from the first slide of this webinar, and then have a look at this research from Kununu in 2018. I could have picked a range of all sorts of different studies, but what's interesting is look at these numbers 1 to 15 and where is the financial issue coming up. What's interesting is that it comes up sometimes, but it's not one of the top. So issues of trust, not being appreciated, lack of respect, little opportunity for growth, feeling underutilized, bad management, poor communication, lack of support or lack of balance, seeing good employees leave, a disconnection with the company's values, or a disconnection with the personal trajectory of the employee. So what's interesting is all of those particular issues there, or most of them anyway, can be dealt with low income strategies as through management of an organization. And what's quite interesting is that most people leave an organization not for the money side of things, but for some of these other ideas on the screen, many of which can be fixed with little monetary investment. So think about your own organization and think for a moment about the most common reason for staff leaving your team or your organization. And how does that compare to this list? Where can you see your organization on this list? And keep that in mind as we move to think about some of the opportunities we have to fix these sorts of problems. So how do we keep staff motivated and engaged? And again, there is a range of research that you could have a look at for this, but today I've just decided just to give you a summary slide, which really points to providing leadership, empowering individuals, creating positive environments, looking at teamwork, recognition and reward systems, knock out boredom and eliminate dissatisfaction, all of which are those more warm, fuzzy type of actions, but important human resources related actions that can be taken in the workplace. So recognition and reward does not have to be financial. There are many particular reward and recognition systems which you can put in place, and the simplest one is coming up to people, shaking their hand and genuinely thanking them for work they've done and being able to do that in a consistent fashion. The eliminating dissatisfaction, particularly be aware if you have staff in repetitive task environments, where they're doing the same thing hour after hour. What can you do to rotate those positions? What can you do to give those people an opportunity to put input into other company activities, organization activities, whether it's looking at improving productivity, whether it's looking at organizing team events, or whether it's helping to strategize the next way forward for the company. There are lots of things to eliminate dissatisfaction. What is really important to note is that these types of interventions do take an investment in time and need strong leaders, but the rewards can be very effective. In my own experience, I was managing pharmacies for approximately 10 years, a staff of up to 50 employees. I spent 30% of my time engaging with the HR side of the business, and compared to the other 9 pharmacies in the that I worked with, we had less staff turnover. We had a greater engagement of our employees, and that demonstrated itself into increased sales compared to some of the other businesses. So my comment here is that it is possible to do. You have to prioritize it and realize the importance of people, and that your managers need the skills to be able to pull that off. What's interesting is that this topic of recognition and reward and positive work environment, it's important to understand the local context, and particularly there are cultural dimensions when it comes to staff motivation and engagement. Some cultures, it needs to be a team-based approach, but in that context, you need to be aware of people who are hiding within the team, aren't contributing. Your process always needs to be open and transparent, and accountable and consistent. And sometimes this can be difficult. But in your environment, what are some of the things happening that are increasing staff motivation and engagement? And can you think of those, what they might be? And if not, can you think about what you could do in terms of activities for such a purpose, or how you could engage your supervisors to think about that? I'm conscious that a number of people on this call are also people who are working with other organisations, often ministries of health, etc., to engage them in the process of improving staff motivation and engagement in staff. And the things we're talking about here are equally as relevant in that context. I'd like to move on at this point and to get you to take a breath and note that when we're talking about staff motivation, it's part of the human resources picture. We won't have time in this webinar, but I would encourage you to look this particular document up. It's the theory of change put out by People That Deliver, looking at the human resources for supply chain management theory of change. It's a combination of 2 diagrams as well as a narrative. And basically, the idea of a theory of change is to help you better understand the elements that affect a primary outcome. Now, in this situation, the long-term outcome we're looking for is that workforce performance is optimized in an organization. And this is what we're trying to achieve. Within the theory of change, we need to consider what things need to be present if this particular outcome is to be achieved. And what we note is that there are 4 key pathways: staffing, skills, working conditions, and motivation. Those 4 pathways need to be active and working well in order for this improved performance to occur. In this discussion today, we're focusing on motivation, and we've touched a little bit on sort of working conditions and a little bit on staffing. But really, engagement and motivation, staff retention is looking at this aspect. But if we want overall productivity and to maintain that and to maintain a stable human resources environment, we need to be thinking about these 4 pathways: staffing, skills, working conditions, and motivation. What's interesting is that when we think about staffing, all critical supply chain positions and competencies filled, have you got the right number of people? Do the people have the skills they need, and can they apply them in their environment? Are the working conditions such that they support performance, and particularly thinking about the physical work environment, but also the social environment being free of discrimination and prejudice? And in terms of motivation, it's one thing for staff members to turn up, but are they motivated and engaged? So I want to encourage you to take the time, if you have some responsibility for human resources environments, to be able to read this theory of change in more detail, but think about the variety of components necessary for this overall improved performance. But today, we're focusing on keeping employees engaged and retained in a work environment. I want to give you some practical tips. This is a particular 10-step plan by eSkill, and it was put out last year. And basically, it's a very simple approach, but getting you to think about what you can do that doesn't cost much money, but that can really change the motivation and engagement of your employees and improve staff retention. So making sure that the vision of your organization, as well as the teams within it, is very clear. Making sure employees have what they need to do their job properly, the tools. Communication well and often. And you need to understand communication in your organizational context. Should it be email? Should it be face-to-face? What are the other methods? I know some organizations have this death by meeting approach, which can be counterproductive. Some have death by email approach, where there are floods of emails, but we need to make sure that the communication channels are appropriate for the cultural context and the people engaged with. The other one is step 4, which is getting everyone engaged. Making sure your managers are watching out for engagement from employees and looking to see how people that aren't engaged could be engaged in order for improvements to take place. Ensuring that we coach for success and practice random acts of kindness. So really encouraging our staff towards the goals we're aiming for. Make sure we act fairly with respect and create trust. Trust and verify, but also try to make work fun. You're at work for a long period of time. Often what we do is very responsible and serious by nature. And that's where we need to trust and we need to work well with the systems. But we can also make it a fun environment. Of particular importance is to give special attention to high potential employees. Now, I'm not talking about favoritism here and ignoring others. I'm talking about making sure that in your performance management policy and approach, that you are able to identify people who are performing well and above average and giving them appropriate opportunities to keep them engaged moving forward. People sometimes say, well, if I show favoritism to one employee and not another, that's going to cause trouble. I would agree. But if you're using a transparent, competency-based approach that you're applying equally across the organization, then it's quite appropriate to be rewarding high potential employees, because these employees will be vital to the growth and strength of your organization moving forward. If you lose them because they move on to another organization for different reasons that you could have prevented, then your organization has lost an opportunity. Step 9 is mainly focused on the private sector, where if there's a lull in business, people get put off. And the whole point here is if business is down, it's important to be creative to try and keep your good talent. And then the final one is implementing incentive programs. And again, to point out, these do not have to be monetary in nature, but they can be. It could be that you have Employee of the Month. You could give a small voucher for a particular benefit, whether it's going to the movies or a lunch voucher. Again, whatever incentive program you used, open and transparent and consistent in nature, are all very important. This particular slide just mentions a few things that, in my experience, I have found extremely helpful when it comes to staff retention and work environment as a way of improving motivation and engagement. It's important that you understand the local marketplace for supply chain management employees. What's happening at your competitor organizations? What's happening in other sectors that employ people that are similar skills to yours? What's happening in the nearby countries? What's happening in the region, depending on your country and cultural context? Good organizations will have a retention strategy specific for the organization, where you've thought through these issues and you're working hard to focus on certain aspects, particularly around the soft parts of human resources, this encouragement and engagement to move things forward. And part of that is also ensuring that all your human resources management procedures are in place and functional. Where your HR systems are not working well, then this contributes to a lack of engagement and motivation. The work environment itself is probably one of the areas that gets least attention. Is the environment safe and secure? Have we particularly thought about an equal opportunity environment to allow women to engage in the workforce? For example, thinking about safety, thinking about appropriate facilities for all staff, and do you conduct environmental checks regularly, and do employees understand their responsibilities? So there are a range of things that we can put in place. Again, they take little money, but they, in my experience, are great contributors to improving motivation and staff engagement, with the ultimate goal of keeping your staff longer. My experience, as I mentioned earlier, is implementing these in organisations that I worked in the private sector. And it's interesting to note, as I interact with colleagues as part of my international work, that I would agree that these strategies can be applied also in the local context. The note that I do want to emphasize about wages is the comments I've made about the importance of wages. It's important that the wage that your company or organization offers is appropriately competitive and an appropriate living wage for the context. If the wage is under a living wage for that context, then people will not be happy with the wages, and that will be a prime motivator. But where the employment wage is fair, particularly in the marketplace and against other employers, then it will be a less factor in motivation, and those other factors we described earlier will predominate. Particular challenge for you from what you've heard today is, what will you now do to improve staff motivation and engagement in your workplace? If you're a leader or a manager, you have significant responsibilities and you can influence change in this regard. If you are an employee that reports to managers, you do have an opportunity to share with your managers some of the things from this presentation and see if that can promote a discussion around improving staff engagement. You might be surprised with the positive approach you get. You may also be concerned of the lack of interest by your managers when it comes to staff motivation and engagement, but I would continue to encourage you in that regard. As we move towards the end of the webinar, I want to take the opportunity to introduce to you some tools. When you get a copy of the slides, these tools are hot linked so that you're able to get a look at those in some detail. This first one is Rapid Retention Survey Toolkit. This is a research methodology that you apply to a particular organisation and cultural context to understand why people want to stay at your organisation. It uses some social research approaches to engage with staff to find out the main reasons that people want to stay, and then uses a mathematical approach that applies a weighting to people's decisions to see which particular combinations of interventions will give you more impact. And the final step is you can actually cost out those particular interventions, whether it's a minor salary increase, offering an education support, improving housing allowance, and so on. And what's interesting is that this particular mathematics can then be presented to the HR department and finance to say, well, if we invest this, we're going to potentially get this increased impact in terms of reduced staff turnover, which converts to productivity. Is it worth it? Very interesting tool. IHRIS Retain is an open access human resources software that allows you to track staff and to track performance and also monitor level of engagement with staff. So two tools that are available and of interest in this topic. So further things that would interest you is two case studies. The Namibia case study is where the rapid retention survey, which I spoke about on the previous slide, was applied to Namibia, particularly to pharmacists and pharmacy assistants, resulting in presenting the government with a range of interventions that would have the potential to improve their staff retention. This was in the context of high staff turnover rates because of large range of higher paying jobs in the government, in the private sector. What was found is that investments in housing, in education, would be needed and would actually give a much larger retention than increasing wages by a large amount. Interesting study. Lots of discussions about incentives and performance-based incentives and results-based incentives. This particular publication from the USA Deliver Project is a very interesting case study of how this approach was used in Mozambique and the results from that country's supply chain. Further, I just wanted to note a range of other tools. There's the options guide and the performance-based incentive toolkit. Both give you step-by-step approaches for performance-based incentives. Both of those are based around finance. Succession planning, which I didn't mention too much in this particular talk today, but is one of the most under-planned for areas. We would encourage organizations to think about where the key positions are in the organizations and the key people that, if they left, would cause significant loss of productivity and performance in your organization, and work to put a plan in place because at some stage that person's going to leave, and you need to do your best to plan for that occurrence so that you can maintain productivity and performance when they go. And this is an area that we don't do enough on, and there's some guide there. A couple of little checklists to finish on work environment that you might find helpful. Many people on the call work in low and middle income countries, particularly in countries where the population, about 85%, are in rural environments. And in those environments, it's very difficult to get health workers to go to those contexts. This particular study, although in 2010, was quite a systematic study, and looking at evidence-based recommendations on how to improve recruitment and retention of health workers in underserved areas, which is more rural and remote areas. This is an excellent read if you have a leadership role in an organization that has a country footprint in remote and rural areas. It's always good to find what others are doing. I have a range of resources, but it's never got everything. And I would be encouraging you, as you talk about this in your organization, to think about resources that you found helpful and to consider how you might be able to share those with others. As we conclude today, I wanted to really emphasize the importance of measuring staff turnover, even if you're just measuring it against yourself, and even better if you can measure it against other organizations to give you an idea of how you're going. Really understand what the cost is of high staff turnover, and I wanted you to really understand the importance of lack of productivity, as well as a reduction in the good name of your organization. To note that although we understand that staff turnover is a big issue, leaders and managers in organizations are not giving it the priority that's required if we're going to address this particular issue. And so my encouragement would be to think about where the focus is in your organization on motivation and engagement and how that can be addressed. I wanted to also remind you to look at the people that deliver human resources theory of change to really understand the other elements to get good productivity from staff in a way that maintains and grows HR systems. I want you to think about these practical approaches and what particular tasks you can do, and then to remind you that there is a range of tools that are available for you to use. And with that, I want to thank you very much for engaging the webinar today. My contact details are on this slide. You're welcome to keep in touch with me through LinkedIn, email. If you want to read some of my own research on some of these topics, you can go here. And I'm about to launch a YouTube channel, which has the webinars that we've been recording from this series. So with that, I would like to thank you very much and wish you well as you continue to engage in improving staff retention in your own organizations. So with that, we will say thank you very much and bye for now.